In this video, I'm going to show you how to handle forms in Next.js. First, we'll dive into HTML validation, ensuring inputs are correct before sending them to the server. Then, we'll use useActionState to manage form submission state and handle input field resets after a successful submission. I'll also show you how to display validation errors to the user and notifications as well. First up is Mongoose, a library for MongoDB and Node.js. Then there's Sod, a data validation library for TypeScript and JavaScript. For styling, I'm using DaisyUI, a plugin for Tailwind CSS. And lastly, React Hot Toast is for showing notifications. First up, we have a feedback page with a section wrapper, a div, an h1 element, and a feedback form component. And now I'm going to open Components, Feedback Form. This component is flagged as a client component, allowing us to add interactions for the user. We import create feedback action from the actions file. This will be the server action responsible for creating feedback. Now, to set up our form handling, we start by initializing the state. Here we're creating an initial state object with two fields: message, which starts as an empty string, and success, which is initially set up to false. This is the basic structure that will hold the state of our feedback form. And now let's head over to the types folder because I want to show you the types. In case you are using TypeScript, feedback state represents the server's response with a message and a success flag, and feedback data represents the form data. And now if we go back to the form, I'm using the useActionState hook, which accepts two parameters: create feedback action and initial state, and from it we're extracting state, form action, and is pending. State is the current form state, which links this component to the result of the server action. Form action is the action or function triggered when submitting the form, and is pending is a boolean indicating if the form submission is in progress. Then we have the form. In this example, I've set up basic HTML validation for the email and message fields, like the email input uses the built-in type equals email, which checks if the format is correct. Plus, I've added min length and max length to ensure the input isn't too long or short. It's simple, fast, and gives the user immediate feedback. Using HTML validation in this form is more convenient than integrating Sod with React Hook Form, especially for simpler forms. It works even with JavaScript turned off, so there's no need to wait for scripts to load. The downside though is that error messages can't be styled easily. React Hook Form is better suited for more complex forms with intricate logic. If you're building something simpler though, like it's more efficient to use useActionState with HTML validation for the front end, and then handle server-side validation with something like Sod. This keeps your code lightweight and fast without sacrificing security or performance. Then I send the data to the server, and later I'll use Sod for backend validation, which will give more detailed checks and return errors if necessary. Below the form, I've added the paragraph to display the result of the form submission, and the submit button is tied to the is pending state. This way, the button shows a loading state when the form is being processed. Let's run a quick test. The invalid pseudo class is already set up in globals.css to generate red borders for invalid inputs. Let's see how it looks and works in the form. This way we can override Tailwind CSS default styles for the input tag and text area, and customize the invalid validation appearance to fit our design. And so now I'm going to head over to source actions and create feedback action. And this is my server action function. In this server action, I'm using Sod for validation and Mongoose to save the feedback into the database. Let's go to source utils and take a quick look at the connectDB function. You can find this function in various places online. For this project, I got this particular one from a blog I came across. And now I'm going to open my .env .example file, and I'm I have this database URL environment variable for connecting to MongoDB. And so now let's head back to the server action file. Now let's quickly review the schema in models feedback. Here we define a structure for the feedback data will be saved into our database. The email field is required, trimmed, and converted to lowercase. We also use a regular expression to ensure that the email format is valid. For the text field, it's also required and must be between 4 and 1,000 characters long, enforcing a minimum and maximum length. Finally, we have the timestamps option enabled, so Mongoose automatically tracks when a feedback is created and updated. And now let's go back to create feedback action. First, I define a validation schema with SOD to ensure that the email and message meet the required criteria email format, length restrictions, and required fields. Then I grab the form data, validate it against the schema, and check if it passes. If the validation fails, I return a failure response with a generic error message. Once the data is validated, we connect to the database using the connectDB function and create a new feedback entry using the feedback.create method. If everything works out, we return a success response with a confirmation message. If an error occurs at any step, a failure response is returned with an error message indicating the feedback couldn't be processed. Now it's time to test it out. I submit the form and you'll see the success message pop up. If we head over to Chrome DevTools and check the network tab, you can see the data is being sent successfully. Everything's working as it should. Now I'm going to go back to VS Code and scroll down to source data where we grab the email and text, and I'm just gonna go ahead and add a next here, and I'm going to see if I can get an error message, and if I click on send I get an error message in red. So now I'm heading to the types file and adding a new type. This type will help me display validation errors to the user. For example, I'll show the errors right under the input fields so it's clear what needs to be fixed. Next, I need to update the types to include an additional field for errors. This field will allow me to store validation errors and display them to the user under the corresponding input fields. It's important because it helps guide the user by showing exactly what went wrong when they submit the form. When we check if validation has failed, we pass the validation errors to the front end. And now I'm going to navigate to my feedback form component, and here under the text area we're checking if there's an error message for the text field in the state. If there is, we display the first error message. After handling the error message for the text area, let's scroll up to check and handle the email field in the same way. Now in create feedback action I'm going to add a next to email and to text. And after submitting the form, we can see 2 error messages being displayed. And if we fix the error and go back to the form, I'll type the email in the input and text in the text area. Submit the form and we get a success message. We have a problem. When useActionState is used, it resets the inputs after form submission. This is an issue because if the user makes a mistake, they have to re-enter everything. We can fix this by returning form values source data. When there's a validation error, first update the types and add form values. Next, go to the form component, use default value to keep the inputs field with the user's data after a validation error. First, I'm going to add a default value for email with state, form values, email, or an empty string. And after that, I'm going to scroll down and add another default value but for the text area. For the text, default value equals state.formValues.text or an empty string. Let's run the validation test again. This time, instead of passing source data to schema safe parse, I'll pass in email empty and text empty to simulate an invalid form submission. This will trigger the validation errors. Let's check if we are getting the user input data back, and there is the user data. As you can see, even after a validation error, the fields retain the values the user entered. And now let's delete this object and pass source data again. Now let's take things a step further and handle general notifications to keep the user informed. So I'm gonna head over to layout and we'll use React Hot Toast notifications to alert the user of a success or failure when submitting the form. And now I'm going to go back to the feedback form and import Toast from React Hot Toast. And then I'm going to scroll down and add useEffect. This useEffect block runs whenever it's pending state.message or state.success changes. It checks if its pending is false and state.message exists. If state.success is true, it displays a success toast with a message. Otherwise, it shows an error toast. Both toasts appear at the top center and last 4 seconds. Now let's scroll up to the top of the file and import useEffect. Let's take a look at the full file to see how everything comes together. And now back in the browser, if we submit the form, we get a toast message at the top center of the page. We can delete the state.message block notification because it's better to use toast notification in these cases for general messages or feedback. Alright, that's it for today. If you find it useful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Catch you in the next one.